The war in Europe was over. The guns had almost fallen silent. Church bells rang across towns that had survived years of bombing. Families poured into the streets believing the nightmare had finally ended. American soldiers laughed, smoked, and dreamed about the ships that would soon carry them home. Yet hundreds of miles to the east, another nightmare was only beginning. Thousands of exhausted prisoners waited behind Soviet lines, believing their own freedom was just days away. Instead, the trains stopped. The gates remained closed. Armed guards refused to let them leave. No one could explain why. Then a report reached one of the most aggressive generals in the U.S. Army. General George S. Patton read the message carefully. His expression changed. According to officers on the ground, Allied prisoners who should have been released were still being held in territory controlled by the Soviet Union. The war had ended, but something had gone terribly wrong. Imagine standing in Germany during the first weeks after victory. Burned cities stretched across the horizon. Roads were crowded with refugees, surrendered German soldiers, liberated prisoners, and long columns of Allied trucks. Every bridge, rail line, and crossroads carried people trying to return home. Yet nobody truly controlled the chaos. The borders drawn on military maps did not always match the reality on the ground. Entire groups of prisoners found themselves trapped behind new occupation lines before anyone fully understood what had happened. By early May 1945, Germany had collapsed. On 7 May, German representatives signed the first instrument of surrender at Reims in France. The following day, a second ceremony took place in Berlin to satisfy Soviet demands. Europe celebrated victory in Europe Day. To millions, it felt like history had finally reached its happy ending. But inside military headquarters, senior commanders already knew that peace would not arrive as quickly as newspapers promised. The Western Allies and the Soviet Union had fought together against Adolf Hitler, but they had never fully trusted each other. Their partnership had been built on necessity rather than friendship. As German resistance disappeared, those hidden disagreements surfaced almost immediately. Every liberated town, every railway station, and every prisoner camp became part of a much larger political struggle over who would shape post-war Europe. General George S. Patton commanded the U.S. Third Army, one of the fastest-moving formations of the entire war. His armored columns had crossed France, broken through German defenses during the Battle of the Bulge, and driven deep into Central Europe. His men respected his boldness even when they questioned his methods. Patton believed speed, surprise, and relentless pressure won wars. Waiting for politicians to solve military problems was not something he enjoyed. During the final weeks of fighting, American forces liberated numerous German prison camps holding Allied prisoners of war. Starving soldiers emerged wearing worn uniforms that barely hung together. Many had survived years of captivity. Their first meal tasted like freedom. Their first sight of an American flag felt almost unreal. For thousands, the journey home had finally begun. But not everyone was so fortunate. As armies advanced from opposite directions, some camps were evacuated by the Germans. Prisoners were forced onto long marches across frozen roads before being overtaken by Soviet forces. Others were located in regions assigned to Soviet occupation under Allied agreements. In the confusion, groups of Allied personnel suddenly found themselves dependent on Soviet authorities for transportation and repatriation. The reports reaching American headquarters were often incomplete. One message suggested a transport had been delayed. Another described paperwork that had not yet been approved. Another spoke of prisoners still waiting for rail connections. None of these reports alone seemed alarming. Together they formed a troubling pattern. Liberation was becoming slower than expected. Patton had already developed deep doubts about Soviet intentions. Throughout the campaign into Germany, he watched Soviet forces secure territory with remarkable speed. He admired their fighting ability against the Wehrmacht, but he also believed Moscow intended to dominate Eastern Europe long after the war ended. Those concerns made every delayed prisoner report seem more significant. Meanwhile, the political situation grew increasingly complicated. At conferences earlier in the war, Allied leaders had agreed on occupation zones for defeated Germany. These agreements required armies to halt in certain areas even if they could advance farther. Military logic sometimes clashed with political promises. Commanders who wanted to keep moving received orders to stop. Patton accepted those orders reluctantly, believing opportunities were being lost. As May turned into June 1945, prisoner recovery became one of the largest logistical operations in modern history. Millions of people required transportation, food, medical treatment, and identification. Railways damaged by bombing struggled to handle the enormous traffic. Disease threatened overcrowded camps. Every delay created new suffering. Within this confusion, stories spread among American units that some liberated prisoners were still waiting behind Soviet checkpoints. Officers attempted to verify the information. Diplomatic channels opened discussions with Soviet commanders responsible for local sectors. Sometimes cooperation worked well. At other times, answers came slowly or not at all. Frustration grew on both sides. Patton rarely hid his opinions. Private conversations revealed increasing concern that political leaders underestimated future problems with the Soviet Union. He believed the alliance formed during wartime was already beginning to unravel. While many hoped lasting cooperation remained possible, Patton saw warning signs almost everywhere. His staff also understood that every decision carried enormous consequences. A local misunderstanding between American and Soviet troops could quickly become an international crisis. Both armies remained heavily armed. Tanks, artillery, and fighter aircraft were still positioned across Europe. One careless incident could destroy the fragile peace that millions had sacrificed to achieve. The prisoners themselves knew little about these political calculations. They counted the days. Some had hidden scraps of paper listing family members they hoped were still alive. Others carried photographs worn almost smooth after years inside prison camps. They believed liberation meant the waiting was over. Instead, uncertainty returned. American liaison officers continued requesting updates through official military channels. Soviet headquarters often answered that transportation difficulties or administrative procedures caused the delays. Sometimes trains arrived, sometimes they did not. Every explanation sounded reasonable by itself, yet the overall picture remained troubling. At the same time, another humanitarian crisis unfolded across Europe. Millions of displaced civilians wandered roads searching for home. Former forced laborers, concentration camp survivors, refugees, and prisoners all competed for the same limited transport network. Sorting identities became incredibly difficult. Languages, missing documents, and destroyed records complicated every effort. Even so, Patton remained unconvinced that logistics alone explained every delay. His wartime experience taught him that military organizations moved quickly when they truly wanted results. If thousands of people remained stranded, someone possessed the authority to change that situation. Inside headquarters, intelligence summaries began painting a broader picture of Soviet behavior across Eastern Europe. Local governments increasingly answered to Moscow. Political opponents disappeared. Borders hardened. Temporary military occupation appeared to be becoming something much more permanent. For Patton, these developments reinforced his belief that wartime cooperation was fading faster than many leaders wished to admit. Yet, he also understood his limits. American generals did not set foreign policy. Final decisions rested with political leaders in Washington, London, and Moscow. A field commander could recommend, protest, and negotiate through military channels, but he could not independently challenge Allied agreements without risking consequences far beyond the battlefield. The waiting continued. Families in the United States expected telegrams announcing that loved ones were finally on their way home. Instead, some received nothing. Military officers answered questions as best they could, often with incomplete information. Hope slowly mixed with anxiety. Across occupied Germany, American soldiers noticed something changing. Soviet checkpoints became stricter. Cooperation that had seemed friendly during the first days after victory became more cautious. Small disagreements over roads, bridges, and patrol boundaries increased. None of these incidents alone suggested another war. Together, they hinted that the alliance forged against Hitler was beginning to fracture. Patton watched these developments with growing concern. He believed history was moving much faster than politicians realized. Every delayed prisoner report, every disputed checkpoint, every tense meeting between officers seemed connected. To him, Europe stood at the edge of a new and uncertain era. Then another intelligence report reached headquarters. It suggested that the issue extended beyond isolated transport delays. More Allied personnel remained under Soviet control than previously believed, and negotiations were producing little progress. Senior officers gathered to review the latest information. Maps covered the tables. Rail routes were examined. Occupation boundaries were checked again and again. The room fell unusually quiet. Patton looked toward Eastern Europe and understood that the next decision would not simply affect a handful of prisoners. It could shape the relationship between yesterday's allies for years to come. And what happened next would convince many officers that the Second World War had ended. But a far more dangerous struggle was already beginning. The room remained silent as the latest intelligence reports were placed across the table. Officers compared maps, transportation records, and occupation boundaries. The problem was becoming clearer. The end of the war had not brought immediate freedom to everyone. Thousands of Allied soldiers and civilians were still scattered across Eastern Europe, and recovering them depended on cooperation between governments that no longer trusted one another. Military liaison teams increased their contacts with Soviet headquarters. Every request was carefully written. Every meeting was handled with caution. On paper, both sides remained allies. In reality, every conversation revealed how quickly that alliance was changing. Soviet commanders insisted that transportation, damaged railways, and administrative problems explained the delays. American officers accepted that Europe faced enormous logistical challenges, but they also knew that weeks were passing while families waited desperately for news. General George S. Patton watched these developments with growing frustration. Throughout the war, he had built his reputation by solving problems through speed and decisive action. Now he faced an obstacle that tanks could not overcome. Political agreements determined where American forces could move. Even the commander of the Third Army could not simply cross into Soviet-controlled territory to recover prisoners. Military power had reached its limit. Diplomacy now controlled the battlefield. You can almost feel the tension inside headquarters. Outside, victory celebrations still echoed across Europe. Newspapers printed photographs of smiling soldiers returning home. Yet behind closed doors, commanders studied reports that suggested the peace itself was becoming fragile. Every delayed convoy, every disputed checkpoint, and every unanswered request hinted that yesterday's partnership was already fading. The situation was made even more complicated by one of the largest humanitarian disasters in modern history. Millions of displaced people filled camps across Europe. Former prisoners of war stood beside concentration camp survivors, forced laborers, refugees, and civilians searching for missing relatives. Rail lines had been bombed, bridges lay in ruins, fuel remained scarce. Food had to be distributed across entire countries that had stopped functioning only weeks earlier. Recovering every Allied prisoner became one of the greatest logistical operations ever attempted. Even with those difficulties, American leaders continued pressing for the return of every serviceman they could locate. Recovery teams searched former German camps, hospitals, and temporary shelters. Medical officers examined men who had survived years of captivity. Some prisoners weighed barely half of what they had before the war. Others carried permanent injuries caused by forced marches and starvation. Their greatest wish was simple. They wanted to go home. Patton believed that every American still waiting deserved immediate attention. His private opinions about the Soviet Union became increasingly blunt. He warned fellow officers that Moscow intended to keep expanding its influence across Eastern Europe. While many political leaders hoped wartime cooperation could continue, Patton feared that another great rivalry had already begun. His comments did not remain private forever. Senior officials in Washington became concerned that one of America's most famous generals was speaking too openly about relations with the Soviet Union. The United States government wanted to preserve Allied cooperation, while peace settlements were still being negotiated. Public confrontation could damage those efforts. Patton, however, rarely softened his opinions simply because they were unpopular. Across occupied Germany, American and Soviet patrols continued meeting at bridges, road junctions, and railway crossings. Most encounters remained professional. Soldiers exchanged greetings, cigarettes, and sometimes photographs. Yet beneath the surface, suspicion continued to grow. Both sides watched each other's movements more carefully than before. The trust built during the final battles against Nazi Germany slowly disappeared. Meanwhile, thousands of prisoners gradually found their way home through negotiations, organized transportation, and international coordination. It did not happen as quickly as families hoped, but the recovery effort continued month after month. Some men returned by train through Germany. Others boarded aircraft or ships after long journeys across Europe. Every arrival at a reception center brought emotional reunions that had once seemed impossible. Not every repatriation story ended happily. One of the darkest chapters of the post-war period involved the forced return of many Soviet citizens from Western-controlled areas back to the Soviet Union. Under agreements reached by the Allies, numerous former Soviet prisoners of war and civilians were sent back despite fears that some would face severe punishment. Historians continue to debate these decisions because many of those people suffered greatly after returning home. The tragedy showed that political agreements often carried painful human consequences. For Patton, these events reinforced his belief that the peace was being built on unstable ground. He increasingly argued that the Soviet government should not be viewed simply as another wartime partner. His opinions placed him further away from official American policy, which still sought cooperation wherever possible. By the late summer of 1945, another major change arrived. On 2 September, Japan formally surrendered aboard the battleship USS Missouri, bringing the Second World War to its official conclusion. Around the world, people celebrated the end of 6 years of global conflict. Yet in Europe, new political divisions were already becoming impossible to ignore. Within months, Winston Churchill would warn of an Iron Curtain descending across the continent. Although he delivered that famous speech in March 1946, many officers who had served in occupied Germany felt they had already seen the first signs during the months immediately following Germany's surrender. Borders hardened. Communication became more difficult. Former allies increasingly viewed each other through suspicion rather than trust. Patton himself would not remain in command much longer. In October 1945, he was removed from command of the Third Army and transferred to lead the 15th Army, whose primary mission involved compiling the official history of the European campaign. The reassignment reflected several controversies, including public remarks that embarrassed senior leaders. Although he remained a respected battlefield commander, his influence over occupation policy declined significantly. Then, tragedy struck unexpectedly. On 9 December 1945, while traveling near Mannheim, Germany, Patton's staff car collided with a U.S. Army truck. Most of the passengers suffered only minor injuries, but Patton sustained a devastating spinal injury that left him paralyzed. Despite receiving medical treatment, complications followed. On 21 December 1945, General George S. Patton died at the age of 60. One of America's most famous wartime commanders never lived to witness the full Cold War that would dominate the next 4 decades. After his death, debates about Patton only grew stronger. Supporters argued that he recognized the growing danger posed by Soviet expansion earlier than many other Western leaders. Critics responded that his aggressive personality and outspoken comments sometimes oversimplified an extremely complex political situation. Historians continue discussing exactly how accurate his warnings proved to be. What remains beyond dispute is that relations between the former Allies deteriorated with remarkable speed after the guns of World War II fell silent. The prisoner recovery efforts eventually succeeded in bringing home vast numbers of Allied servicemen, but the process revealed how fragile international cooperation had become. Every successful exchange required negotiation. Every convoy depended on political approval. Every delayed transport reminded commanders that military victory alone could not guarantee peace. Imagine standing at a railway station in Germany during those uncertain months. A train finally arrives after weeks of waiting. Thin, exhausted soldiers step onto the platform carrying little more than the clothes they wear. Medical teams rush forward. Families will soon receive the telegrams they have prayed for. Yet beyond the horizon, new checkpoints are rising, new borders are forming, and new rivalries are taking shape. The celebration of one war quietly becomes the beginning of another struggle. Many dramatic stories describe a single explosive confrontation between Patton and Stalin over prisoners of war. Reality was different, but in many ways even more important. The real conflict unfolded through negotiations, occupation policies, political disagreements, and growing distrust rather than a single dramatic showdown. It was a battle fought with maps, agreements, diplomatic messages, and competing visions for the future of Europe. The greatest lesson from this forgotten chapter is that peace is rarely as simple as the moment a war ends. Victory Day closed one of history's bloodiest conflicts, but it opened the door to a new era defined by suspicion, ideology, and nuclear rivalry. Men who had fought side by side against Adolf Hitler would soon stand on opposite sides of barbed wire and guarded frontiers. General George S. Patton never commanded troops in the Cold War. He never faced Soviet armies in battle after Germany's surrender. But the concerns he expressed during those uncertain months reflected the fears of many officers who watched the wartime alliance begin to unravel almost immediately. The struggle over prisoners, occupation zones, and the future of Eastern Europe became some of the earliest warning signs that the world was entering a dangerous new chapter. The battlefield had changed. The enemy had changed. The weapons would change. But the tension that settled over Europe in 1945 would shape global history for generations. The Second World War had ended. The Cold War had already begun.